The night was tense as a young black man faced the towering security guard, fists clenched. What happened next shattered everything he thought he knew about anger and justice. But the real twist? That comes later. Let's start from the beginning. It was a typical morning at Denver International Airport, the kind where the usual chaos of travel enveloped the terminal. The buzz of chatter, the clatter of rolling luggage, the constant movement of passengers. Everything blended into a familiar hum. Among the crowd, Marcus Johnson walked with ease. In his late 30s, he was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit, his appearance the very picture of professionalism. His dark skin, smooth face, and confident stride made him look as though he belonged in a boardroom more than an airport. Unlike the rushed travelers around him, Marcus seemed untouched by the tension of the morning. He was focused, thinking ahead to the important meeting awaiting him in Washington, D.C., where he was set to assume his new position as the head of aviation security. This meeting would mark a major turning point in his career, and the stakes were high. He felt the weight of it all, but wore it with calm poise. As he approached the security checkpoint, two officers, Richard Collins and Amy Parker, watched him with growing curiosity. They exchanged a quick glance, both sizing him up with a glance that seemed to linger just a little too long. There was something about Marcus's composed demeanor, his style, and his self-assurance that didn't quite fit the image they had of someone of his apparent rank. Both officers felt the stirrings of doubt, but neither voiced it, instead deciding to act on an unspoken assumption. "Sir, could you step aside for further screening?" Officer Collins's voice was abrupt and commanding, a tone designed to leave little room for resistance. Marcus paused for a brief second, then nodded, his face unreadable. "Is there a problem?" His voice was steady, though a faint trace of confusion flickered in his eyes. "Just a random check," Officer Parker responded, her tone smooth but laced with something else. Skepticism, perhaps. Marcus wasn't convinced, but he didn't push the issue. This wasn't the first time he'd felt like an outsider in a sea of strangers. Still, something about this moment felt different. Something wasn't right. As the officers moved toward him, Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but outwardly, he remained calm. This wasn't just about the inconvenience of being detained. It was the beginning of something that would shift everything he thought he knew. The interrogation room was small, its cold, sterile atmosphere made even more oppressive by the buzzing fluorescent lights above. Marcus sat rigidly on a metal chair, the cold surface seeping into his bones as he tried to keep his composure. His briefcase lay open on the table, its contents spilled carelessly, papers strewn across the surface with no regard for order. Officer Collins slammed the briefcase shut with an angry snarl, then yanked it from the table, his hands rough and deliberate. "What's in this?" he barked, his voice sharp. He didn't wait for an answer, roughly prying the case open again, making it clear that he wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for an excuse. Marcus's patience, already stretched thin, snapped. The irritation simmered inside him, hot and suffocating, but he kept his voice level, forcing his words through clenched teeth. "Is this necessary?" Officer Parker, standing in the corner with arms crossed, muttered something under her breath, her voice laced with suspicion. "Maybe you've got something to hide. We've seen this before." Marcus's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let the panic show. He was used to this, the cold assumption, the judgmental eyes that lingered a little too long, the casual dismissal of his identity. It was a pattern he knew all too well. He was no stranger to prejudice masquerading as procedure, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The racism was unmistakable now, obvious in the way they treated him, like he was just another black man who didn't belong. A man of no importance, no authority. Around him, the room was growing crowded, whispers and murmurs of disbelief filling the air. A few people had gathered, sensing something was wrong, but no one dared to intervene. Marcus's blood boiled. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His voice was louder than he intended, shaking with a mix of frustration and defiance. "I'm the new head of aviation security," he snapped, the words leaving his mouth like a punch. But the officers didn't flinch. They just smirked, dismissing him with a wave. "Protocol's protocol, sir," Officer Collins said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus felt his fists clench. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an attack. And something told him, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The tension in the room thickened as Marcus was kept there far longer than necessary, humiliated in front of the growing crowd of travelers. The officers made no effort to hide their contempt, repeating the same questions, demanding to see his credentials, documents they already had on file. The situation had become a spectacle, and every moment stretched into what felt like an eternity. Marcus's patience was evaporating fast. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his body rigid with barely contained fury. He could hear the murmurs of the onlookers, the sympathy of some, the confusion of others, but there was no mistaking the whispers that hinted at what they all knew. The racial undertones were unmistakable. For a moment, it seemed like the whole terminal was watching, waiting for something to snap. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door to the room swung open. A woman entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. Christine Morris, the head of airport security, stood in the doorway, her expression calm but focused. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm but not harsh. Officer Collins, defensive and unwilling to admit the wrong, quickly explained, "Just a routine check. He's being difficult." Christine's gaze flickered toward Marcus, her eyes narrowing for a brief second. Then, recognition flashed across her face. She'd heard the name before, the new head of aviation security. Her voice shifted as she turned back to the officers, now laced with authority. "You know who this is, don't you?" The officers exchanged a quick, guilty look, their expressions betraying their confusion. "Mr. Marcus Johnson," Christine continued, her words biting. "The new head of aviation security. Release him immediately." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the steady burn of anger finally igniting into a full-blown inferno. He stood up, his voice shaking with fury, but clear and strong. "You treat me like a criminal because of the color of my skin," he said, each word cutting through the tense air like a blade. "You didn't even bother to ask. You assumed." A sense of vindication washed over Marcus as the officers reluctantly released him and apologized. Their attempts to save face were futile. He stood there, seething but resolute, as the onlookers looked on, some ashamed, others nodding in silent support. But it wasn't just about being released. The humiliation he had suffered, the blatant disrespect, wasn't something easily forgotten. Yet, Marcus found solace in knowing that the truth had come to light. He wasn't just a random passenger. He was the man who would change the very system that allowed such discrimination to flourish. As he turned to leave, Christine Morris approached him again, offering a hand. "Marcus, I'm truly sorry for this. It should never have happened." Marcus shook her hand, his anger subsiding, but his resolve solidifying. "Make sure it never happens again," he replied, his voice steady and unyielding. He knew this was just the beginning. The system would change, and he would be the one to lead that charge. As he walked out of the room, a sense of satisfaction settled in his chest. The justice that had been denied to him was finally restored, but the fight was far from over.